testing and understanding learner differences. I've been through all of this, so I'll be giving you a historical perspective on why and how all of this stuff came to be. Uh, when I first started in school, the only standardized tests that we had were IQ tests. And eventually we did achievement tests, we did aptitude tests, and I graduated from high school in '67. There were no placement tests in college at that point. So, it was really kind of an interesting time. But politics got involved, and we're going to talk about some of the politics right now, or eventually anyway. Assessment is an integral part of education. It wasn't back in 1955 when I started school. Some studies report that teachers spend as much as 20 to 30% of their time engaged in some form of assessment activity. It is important for teachers to understand the nature of assessment and how it affects students. It is important for teachers to make a distinction between assessment and testing. Assessment is a process of collecting relevant data and information on student performance. It includes information on the student's classroom performance, extracurricular activities, and personal history, often supported by various testing results. Testing is a measurement of sample of behavior. So the testing has to do with a math test or an English test. The assessment is everything they use to determine how the child is doing, including testing. Assessment is a comprehensive process that often incorporates testing. Testing plays a supportive role, but has limited utility by itself. Assessment involves actual inferences based on information gathered about the student. Assessments help teachers come to conclusions about student progress and their educational needs. Another important distinction teachers should be aware of is the difference between evaluation and measurement. Evaluation is a systematic investigation of the worth or merit of an object, where an object is virtually any area of interest. In schools, evaluations take place for student performance, educational programs, school effectiveness, and teacher quality, among others. Measurement is the process of quantifying performance, effectiveness, or characteristics of some area of interest. This involves taking something of interest and assigning a numeric value. Evaluations are process-oriented. They typically have a series of defined steps that lead to a conclusion regarding the effectiveness of the area being assessed. Evaluations are a defined series of steps designed to answer questions regarding effectiveness. The evaluation process is likely to incorporate many measurements as evaluators seek to represent behaviors or events as numbers. Representing events as numbers allows for easy comparisons. There are problems with this process, as not all educational areas of interest are easily represented with numerical data. And this, of course, is also the problem with psychology. A lot of times we are assigning numbers to Beck's depression inventory, for example. Depression, how in the world do you quantify depression? How do you quantify anxiety? But of course, these inventories that we have created create numbers that we use to determine if somebody is depressed or anxious or whatever. The classroom teacher uses a type of testing that differs from the mandated tests required in most states. A classroom teacher uses classroom tests. These tests are usually self-developed or are commercially available for the express purpose of helping the teacher assess the performance of a particular student. The goal of classroom testing is not to compare the performance of one student to another, but to document individual learning. Classroom tests take many forms: homework, quizzes, informal class discussions, chapter tests, experiments, and presentations. Each of these testing approaches is likely to vary substantially from one teacher to another. Standardization in standardized tests means the test has uniform or standard content, administration procedure, scoring protocol, and format for presenting results. Individuals do not construct these tests, instead, large companies who can handle the significant resources needed for test development to produce these documents. These are the individuals that produce the documents, these large companies. Standardized tests are commercially available and assess a wide range of academic personal skills. School administrators often purchase these tests to document learning progress for a particular grade level in one school compared to other schools. So what we're trying to do is compare our students with students at other schools. In 1975, a landmark piece of legislation passed causing major changes in teaching. The Education for All Handicapped Act, Public Law 94-142, mandates a free and appropriate public education for all children with disabilities. Before 1975, if your child was autistic, they potentially didn't go to school. If they had, if they were seeing impaired, vision impaired, or hearing impaired, potentially they didn't go to school, or they went to a special school for people with hearing impairment or vision impairment. But that was before 1975. After 1975, they needed to be evaluated by the school district to determine if they could, if the school district could accommodate them. And usually, according to PL 94-142, they had to accommodate them. This was groundbreaking legislation and brought significant reform to the education of children with special learning needs. It also highlighted the need to identify children with special needs. Now, the reality is that before 1975, there was no special education classes. If you had a child with a learning disability, they didn't get any help from the school district. School district didn't have to do it, and most school districts didn't want to spend the money for it. But after 1975, it was a public law. It was a federal law, so every state had to establish a special education class where the all the individuals, any individual with any deficit, intellectual deficit, had to be taught as much as possible. Public Law 94-142 was groundbreaking legislation and brought significant reform to the education of children with special learning needs. It also highlighted the need for tools to identify children with special needs. The law has undergone several revisions, most recently in 2004, and is now referred to as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, IDEIA. Standardized testing is one of the primary tools used in the identification process. These tests are designed to assess everything from intelligence, memory, and language to a whole host of behavioral problems such as aggression, emotional problems such as depression. And this is George W. Bush, who actually signed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act in 2004. The specific tests used in an assessment would ideally be based on the unique qualities of the student, but all too frequently tests are based on general referral questions. The referral question defines the suspected problem or issue. Does the student have learning disability in math? This question provides direction for assessment, but often fails to capture the unique issues experienced by the student. Comprehensive testing gives us a holistic view of the student and makes diagnosis and treatment more effective. Testing to identify unique student needs is another area where collaboration among professionals helps to produce quality education using a variety of experts, psychologists, doctors, social workers, teachers, parents, to conduct an assessment produces a more comprehensive understanding of the individual. No, not only do different professionals rely on different tools for assessment, but they also bring to the situation a unique perspective. Such collaborative approaches are becoming more common as schools strive to develop precise and effective interventions. Another educational use for testing is accountability. As public institutions, schools are accountable to the American people. This means that the public has a right to assurances that schools are educating in an effective manner. And this was the question in the 2000 election. 2000 election was between Al Gore and George W. Bush, and Bush ran on a platform of accountability for education. He wanted standardized tests given to every child to make sure that they were learning. Education in the United States was before controlled by each state. Each state had their own laws. Each state had their own rules, and they still do. Each state still has their own rules. But in 2000, of course, the argument was that there was no accountability. They didn't have to actually teach people, and this was a problem. Because education hasn't always been the same. In the North, there's always been public education. In the South, there wasn't public education, universal public education, until after World War I. And one of the things that happened during World War I, they tested all the soldiers, and what they discovered was that there were a large number of Southern soldiers who didn't know how to read. And the reason they didn't know how to read is because they didn't go to school. And the reason they didn't go to school was because they didn't have to. There was public education, but they didn't have to go. So after World War I, then they passed laws for public education everywhere. But each state had to do it. Now, the other problem was that there were a large number of African Americans living in the South and not so many of them living in the North. And because of that, in the South, they decided that they would educate African Americans and the Caucasian population separately. And this was separate but equal. This is the separate but equal laws. And of course, that was overthrown in 1954. But no one forced the southern states to educate blacks in white schools. No one forced them to do that. That happened in the 1960s and 1970s. And at that point, there were a lot of the white students started going to private schools, private religious schools. So there was a movement in the United States to start paying for giving vouchers to private schools, to private school students. So this not only included the religious schools, but also included these schools that were cropping up in order for that white kids wouldn't have to go to school with black kids in the South primarily. But it also happened in Massachusetts. Okay, and that's what we're actually arguing about today. And the whole voucher question has come up over and over and over again. And there is one party, the Republican Party, are supporting school vouchers for everybody, meaning that the states not only have to pay for to maintain the public schools, but they also have to pay. Some of the federal money will go into supporting the private schools as well. And this had never happened before. The parochial schools that were controlled but usually by the churches, They're, the only private school you paid tuition to go to those schools. The federal government had nothing to do with it. And so in 2000, they started this movement toward accountability. Now, the weird thing is that the accountability that they're talking about is not accountability for everyone. That's just accountability for the public schools. So No Child Left Behind, the No Child Left Behind Act was passed in 2001. Right after Bush took over the presidency, he passed No Child Left Behind. And the idea was that it was supposed to support accountability for the public schools because people were complaining that the public schools weren't any good and that the private schools were better. And sometimes they were. The problem was that all of the laws and all the rules didn't apply to the private schools, also didn't apply to homeschooled individuals. They don't have, there's not the same accountability for homeschooled and for private school individuals. So whereas public schools had to follow all these laws, they couldn't write laws that controlled the private schools. The laws controlling the teachers and what they had to know and what classes they had to take, all of that has to do with public schools. None of that has to do with private schools, as it turns out. Okay, so that's where we are. And politically, this has been a volleyball that has been bouncing, or a beach ball that's been bouncing back and forth, depending on which party is in power in the White House. Democrats have one idea, trying to support public education, and the Republicans have another idea, trying to support private education or homeschooling. And it's a really odd argument. But No Child Left Behind was the first step in the voucher system that President Trump tried to get passed. The responsibility for the performance of our schools is shared responsibility. Teachers, administrators, parents, and lawmakers all share in the responsibility for appropriate education, where schools have relied heavily on testing. As with testing to determine learning outcomes, testing to assess accountability has focused on single tests. I didn't even read all this stuff, did I? I'm sorry. Another educational use for testing is accountability. As a public institution, schools are accountable to the American people. This means that the public has the right to assurances that schools are educating in an effective manner. This accountability has been around since the beginning of public schooling, but beginning but it has taken a different direction in recent years. In particular, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 has established more stringent methods for determining accountability. And like I said, it determines accountability for public schools, but not for private schools. Okay. As with testing to determine learning outcomes, testing to assess accountability has focused on single tests. This has the advantage of being relatively inexpensive and consistent. This information is limited and needs to be viewed in the context of other types of information. In addition to tests measuring learning outcomes, schools should include other sources of information when judging student progress. This could include graduation rates, classroom assignments, and other teacher-developed assessments. Schools should also consider including parental feedback. Every Student Succeeds Act, which was signed into law in 2015, aims to support accountability in schools while providing states with increased flexibility in designing their accountability system. Okay, so what happened in 2001? They passed this broad federal law that said every state had to do exactly the same thing. But there was this hue and cry from not only administrators but also from teachers that they had to teach the test. So they decided that they would, when Barack Obama became president, they decided that they would change all that and they would make it more flexible, make it more liberal. And that's where the Every Student Succeeds Act came in. It allowed the states to do to be to do different things depending on what the education department in that state wanted to do. The ESSA supports accountability by requiring each state to develop its own statewide accountability system, but it wasn't being dictated by the federal government. They just had to do it, and they could make it any way they wanted. This means that states have the flexibility to set their own goals, indicators, and measures of accountability to assess the performance and progress of schools. It also expands the range of indicators that states can use to assess school performance beyond just test scores. While academic achievement is still an important factor, ESSA allows states to consider additional indicators such as student growth, graduation rates, English language proficiency, and school climate. ESSA also requires states to publicly report the performance and progress of schools and districts. This transparency ensures that parents, educators, and stakeholders have access to important information about school quality and enables them to hold schools accountable for student outcomes. Now remember, this doesn't include private schools. It only includes public schools. ESSA provides targeted support and interventions for schools that consistently underperform or have specific subgroups of students who are not meeting achievement targets. The idea behind this was that the states would come in and they would have to spend money on the schools that were underperforming. States are required to identify these schools and develop improvement plans to help them address their challenges and improve outcomes for all students. Now remember, this only includes public schools. The ESSA emphasizes providing support and resources to schools based on their individual needs. It encourages states to target resources to schools with the greatest needs, such as those with high concentrations of low-income students or struggling subgroups. This targeted approach helps ensure that the schools receive the necessary support to improve their performance. ESSA encourages evidence-based practices and strategies for school improvement. States are required to provide technical assistance and support for help schools implement effective interventions and strategies that have been proven to increase student achievement and address the specific challenges that they face. Overall, ESSA promotes accountability by requiring states to develop robust accountability systems, expanding the range of indicators used to assess school performance, ensuring transparency through public reporting, providing support for low-performing schools, and promoting evidence-based practices for school improvement. By doing so, ESSA aims to enhance the quality of education and the outcomes of all students. The ever-increasing focus on testing in education has led some students to experience excessive testing pressure. High-stakes testing refers to testing practices that result in excessively important consequences. The nature of the consequence varies: failure to graduate from high school, not getting into the school's gifted program, losing a financial scholarship, etc. The idea that significant personal and educational costs result from the performance on a test has led to some concern. The stress created by undue consequences being placed on a single measure of performance has gained attention in recent years. Often this affects individual students, but high-stakes testing also affects entire schools as new legislation establishes procedures for sanctioning schools that fail to perform up to state standards. And of course, I was teaching in a school in Oklahoma City that, of course I was, that had problems with their student body. It was a low-income area. They had a lot of students with special needs, and they were not passing their standardized tests. This was in 1991. So one of the things that they did, they started having all the teachers use scantrons, those bubble things that you have to color in. Um, what else did they do? Oh, we would have practice days. Fridays were practice days where we practiced taking tests. The idea was that the tests were the students weren't used to taking tests. Didn't work. They still didn't pass the test. The No Child Left Behind legislation of 2001 reauthorized spending for public schools. It also introduced, but this is what it forced them to do. It forced them to be accountable for all of these things, and it forced them to teach the test in essence. It also introduced stringent mandates for annual student testing. The law requires states to test students in reading and math in grades 3 through 8 and again in high school. The law requires states to develop standards for performance in these areas and to ensure tests are testing whether students meet these standards. It should be noted that not all states support the NCLB legislation. Some states have even chosen to opt out of NCLB. Now, the problem with that is they don't get any federal money for public schools. And that is a big problem because the feds pay a lot of money to help educate the children in each state. But some states didn't like it, didn't like the NCLB. NCLB has led to substantial increases in academic testing in schools. School administrators are paying closer attention to their curriculum and how it relates to state standards. Teachers are increasingly concerned with how to give students the necessary information to meet these standards. This has led to an educational climate that is increasingly sensitive to testing. Some have argued that this focus on testing is inappropriate. They believe teachers are so busy teaching students how to perform on state tests that they're pulled away from teaching the curriculum. Others contend state tests are too narrow and only provide a limited view of how our students are performing. Other research shows high-stakes testing has positive effects on the classroom environment. Case study data shows that implementation of high-stakes tests encourages teachers to develop more effective instructional techniques. High-stakes tests can also lead teachers to advocate effectively for needed resources. Some schools respond to the pressure of high-stakes testing by reaffirming their commitment to success and finding the necessary resources to make success a reality. But the cartoon is also true, that teachers start teaching to the first row, not to the back row. The outcomes from states adopting high-stakes testing are not all positive. There is no clear evidence that high-stakes testing increases high school graduation rates. This means that although there appear to be real learning gains, these gains are not translating into increases in long-term academic success. There is also evidence that high-stakes testing leads to greater focus on the areas tested, reading and math, rather than those not included in the assessment, such as the arts, physical education, and music. One potential issue with standardized tests is the possibility that the tests are biased against some groups of students. Cultural bias refers to an unfair penalty on a test due to a student's gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, or other such group-defining characteristics. To address question bias, major test makers go to elaborate means to make certain their tests are not biased. They actively recruit individuals from all lifestyles when standardizing their test. They screen questions for bias against a particular cultural group. Despite these measures to develop culturally fair tests, individual schools that use standardized tests should take steps to review the appropriateness of the test for their particular student population. Another group of students at risk for potential test bias are students with disabilities. Standardized tests may not always be designed or administered in a way that is accessible to all students with disabilities. The format language or presentation of test items can create barriers for students with certain disabilities, such as those with visual impairments or learning disabilities. Standardized tests may include content that is unfamiliar or not aligned with the experiences of students with disabilities. This can create disadvantages for students who have limited exposure to certain topics or experiences due to their disabilities. English language learners face unique challenges when it comes to standardized testing, and educators play a crucial role in facilitating their success. ELL students often struggle with limited English language proficiency, which can significantly impact their performance on standardized tests. Research conducted by Solorzano in 2008 highlights the critical link between English language proficiency and standardized testing among ELL students. Teachers face the challenge of ensuring that ELL students comprehend the test instructions, questions, and response options because language barriers may impede their ability to fully demonstrate their knowledge. Standardized tests are often rooted in the cultural and linguistic context of native English speakers, potentially disadvantaging ELL students. Teachers must strive to bridge this gap by providing culturally sensitive materials, ensuring fair test administration, and considering students' diverse backgrounds to accurately gauge their knowledge and skills. ELL students may experience heightened test anxiety due to language barriers, cultural differences, and unfamiliar testing formats. A study by Wu in 2016 emphasizes that test anxiety negatively impacts ELL students' performance, affecting their ability to access and apply their knowledge effectively. Teachers face the challenge of creating a supportive and inclusive testing environment, offering strategies to manage anxiety, and employing alternative assessment methods that better reflect students' true abilities. Teachers face challenges in identifying appropriate accommodations and ensuring their implementation. Rivera in 2006 emphasizes the importance of individualized accommodations such as extended time, instructions writing in native language, or test items read aloud in native language to support ELL students during standardized tests. Educators must advocate for and provide these accommodations to ensure fair and accurate assessment of ELL students' abilities. The widespread implementation of standardized tests and relative importance of their outcomes brings up the question of whether teachers should specifically teach material they know is on the test. There are several things teachers can do to help students effectively demonstrate their learning on a test, but directly teaching to the test is inappropriate. Teachers should also avoid the following when preparing students for standardized tests. Don't describe the test as difficult to get the students to take it more seriously. Don't use old versions of the test to teach the students unless specifically recommended to do so by the test maker. Don't try to encourage performance by telling students that their performance on this single test will drastically affect their academic lives. Don't modify existing well-planned curriculum simply to support higher test performance. Norm-based tests compare the performance of a given student against other students the same age. A student tested has his or has their test performance compared to other students locally or nationally on the same test. Norm-based tests partially satisfy needs accountability and have for a long time. They're inexpensive to administer, easy to score, and provide a consistent measure of performance. Despite these advantages, there are limitations. The consistent nature of the test translates into less flexibility, possibly making the test less appropriate for some students. The wording of a question may be beyond the life experience of a student, causing him to miss the question. Another issue with norm reference tests is how they are scored. To enhance the test consistency and reliability, scoring is extremely objective. Objective scoring means the answer to a question does not depend on the individual grading the test. A simple multiple choice question is a good example of an objective question. The answer to a given multiple choice question remains the same no matter who grades the test. Compare this to subjective scoring, where the evaluator must make a judgment about the correctness of a given response. The teacher grading an essay question may have certain criteria for grading the essay, but there is likely to be some judgment involved in assigning a grade. Objective scoring makes grading easy, consistent, and inexpensive, but it does limit the types of questions that can be asked. Norm reference tests have been criticized because they do not usually allow students to create an answer. Norm reference tests focus on recognizing correct answers from a set of printed choices to maintain objectivity. This means that norm reference tests are better suited to measuring factual knowledge and less able to assess the critical thinking involved in creating a solution to a less structured question. According to the NCLB, No Child Left Behind, states must establish standards for student learning. They must also use assessments aligned to these standards to establish learning effectiveness. States can either elect to do this by creating their own assessments, or they can choose to modify commercially available tests. What is important is that school assessments are refocusing on meeting pre-established standards rather than relying exclusively on normative student-to-student comparisons, creating a different educational climate. Teachers and administrators have mixed responses to this educational perspective on achievement. Critics contend that standards will negatively affect some students, particularly more advanced students. This is because standards are developed at levels states feel are appropriate for most students. If most instruction is geared to meet this standard, then students requiring instruction that is more individual will not be well served. This is a real concern, and the teachers and schools need to consider this carefully as standards-based instruction, curriculum, and assessment gains momentum. Some teachers are concerned that teaching to standards will take away from their creative freedom and make instruction less exciting and engaging. That's why I have showed the teacher handcuffed. They are concerned that they will spend most of their instructional time teaching students how to take a test. They contend teaching to a test artificially constrains the learning environment. They believe learning needs flexibility so teachers can pursue learning objectives that evolve as instruction progresses. Teaching too strictly to a standard may compromise this flexibility and actually interfere with optimal learning. Some teachers are thoroughly embracing the standards movement. They feel the moving towards instruction feel that based on detailed standards is helping to make their job clearer. Clear professional objectives are, in turn, helping teachers have a clearer plan for meeting the needs of their job. Some feel this is giving teachers a stronger sense of purpose and accomplishment. Qualitative information from teachers indicates that at least some teachers are benefiting professionally from a strong standards-based approach to education. Another consideration in the standards-based movement is the impact on student achievement. Recent research from the Educational Projects and Education Research Center reports there is substantial evidence demonstrating a consistent positive relation between adoption of state standards and student achievement. NAEP has tracked reading and math performance in grades 4 and 8. Results indicate that states adopting clear and specific standards were likely to have greater levels of achievement. The effect was stronger for math than reading. These findings further support a standards approach to education, indicating student learning is actually when states use clear standards. Educational researchers have identified 4 main testing categories: placement assessment, formative assessment, diagnostic assessment, and summative assessment. What information is needed before we begin to teach a given student? It is important for students to have information on students' learning ability, teachers to have information on students' learning abilities, and potential problems before teaching begins. Such information is valuable to the teacher when making necessary placement decisions. Failure to determine learning needs early in the school year increases the probability that advanced students will find the class boring and struggling students will be overwhelmed. Neither situation is positive, and both can be avoided by using placement assessments. Placement assessments help teachers plan effective and rewarding learning experiences for individual students. Placement assessments come in many forms, including previous report cards, self-reports from the students, and academic pretests. Asking the students about their learning interests provides the teacher with excellent information. The student may not have an accurate understanding of their abilities, but perception of their potential for success is an important mediator of learning. Pretests are also help teachers determine a student's existing knowledge. Along with self-report information, teachers can use a variety of informal and formal approaches to gathering information on what students already know, what skills are developing, and what learning objectives are beyond their current abilities. Both self-report and pretest information give the teacher an idea of where to begin. Formative assessment provides information regarding how learning is progressing. It is not usually a single test, but a series of tests designed to give ongoing information about a student's learning. There are a variety of formal and informal formative assessments, including classroom question and answering, interim quizzes, and homework. The exact format of these assessments is likely to vary with the style and training of the teacher, but all serve a common purpose. Formative assessments help the teacher determine if the student is making satisfactory progress. Formative assessments give the teacher the opportunity to intervene before the child encounters excessive failure. This is an important aspect of formative assessments. They give the teacher ongoing information, which allows for intervention before issues become more serious. Despite excellent use of formative assessments, some students still experience significant learning issues. This is when educators turn to diagnostic assessments, which are used to give teachers very precise information on how to address a student's learning difficulty. It is unlikely that the daily ongoing formative types of assessments used by teachers will serve this purpose. Diagnostic tests are conducted by school professionals with specialized training and are likely to consist of several individual tests covering a variety of areas. The results of these diagnostic assessments usually lead to a written intervention plan. It may also lead to a specific diagnostic label and participation in school's special education program. It is important to underscore that participation in special education is not always the outcome of diagnostic testing. It entirely depends on the unique needs of the student. Summative assessment is designed to answer the question, did the student achieve the educational goal? Unlike formative assessments, summative assessments reveal the results of the learning process. Examples of summative assessment include overall or comprehensive tests and state tests. The controversial nature of these tests is not whether they provide useful information, but that they are often used to the exclusion of other types of tests. Use of summative tests without formative tests leads to information on whether students succeeded, but little information on how to make achievements a reality. In order to reach a goal, educators need information on how to reach it. This is unlikely to come from summative assessments, but could come from formative, diagnostic, and placement assessments. There are varieties of tests teachers and school professionals can use to obtain information on student performance. Some of these tests focus on learning potential of the student. Other tests look at actual achievement of the student in different subject areas. The intelligence test has gained prominence in education. It is a commonly administered test and has many uses. It has become popular in assessments to determine eligibility for special education services. Aptitude tests predict how well a student will perform when placed in a new learning situation. They are a measure of student learning capability. Examples of aptitude tests have historically included intelligence tests, but theorists are beginning to consider these tests a separate category given unique issues surrounding our understanding and measurement of intelligence. Other aptitude tests include college entrance exams, such as the Scholastic Assessment Test. Most test users distinguish between aptitude tests and achievement tests, but in reality they are quite similar. Achievement tests typically focus on recent learning, whereas aptitude tests examine learning over the lifespan. Both tests are dependent on knowledge acquisition and prior learning. What really distinguishes the tests is how they are used. Achievement tests assess recent learning in a specific area. Aptitude tests are more likely to predict later performance. Aptitude tests offer educators the following qualities. They are good predictors of academic success. They give information regarding a student's strengths and weaknesses. They provide a systematic way to compare the performances of students in the same situation. They can help teachers develop educational programs that are sensitive to students with special needs. Despite their many advantages, teachers should exercise caution when interpreting aptitude test results. Teachers need to consider whether the questions on the test are truly assessing skills and abilities important to the student's situation. It is critical to reflect on the meaning of a student's performance on a single test in the context of the whole student. Testing only provides a brief glimpse into the skills and capabilities of a student. No single test completely reflects a student's academic progress. It is one piece of the student's academic experience. Considering these cautions helps teachers use aptitude tests appropriately and in the best interest of the student. As educators become more sensitive to assessing the whole student, it is more common to see evaluators use behavioral measures. Behavioral assessments provide a standardized tool for assessing students' behavior, emotionality, and social interactions. The range of attributes assessed depends on the instrument used, but generally includes attention, aggression, depression, anxiety, social skills, and conduct problems. As with other standardized tests, behavioral assessments provide a convenient way to compare the behavioral functioning of one student to others of similar age. Functional behavior assessment is an evaluation to determine what function a student's behavior serves. The term functional refers to the function a behavior plays in the student's daily life. Does the behavior help the student get attention, avoid work, or make friends? Evaluation of any student with special needs may include an FBA, but it is an educational best practice for all students experiencing, but is it an educational best practice for all students experiencing behavioral problems? The increased use of behavioral testing is in part due to increased sensitivity to educating the whole child, but it is also due to changing federal legislation governing special education. Beginning in 1997, educational legislation, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, include direct mandates for behavioral assessment. The law requires educators to assess relevant behavioral factors in addition to cognitive issues when evaluating students for possible placement within special education. The team responsible for special education programs must include appropriate positive behavioral interventions and strategies. For students in special education, IDEA stipulates that a functional behavioral assessment must be conducted before a change in educational placement takes place, if that change is based on an inappropriate behavior. Given the technicalities involved in conducting a thorough and effective FBA, it is important to make sure that the individual conducting the assessment has appropriate training. Until recently, obtaining an appropriately trained individual to conduct these assessments was difficult. There was no national certification, so individual qualifications were based on educational history and relevant experience. The Behavior Analysis Certification Board established a process of certifying behavior specialists. The availability of these certified professionals provides schools and related professionals with a standard for behavioral care. Perhaps no other test in the history of assessment has been both heralded and criticized as the intelligence test. Educationally, it remains one of the most frequently used assessment instruments. Teachers, parents, administrators, and even the individual student place enormous importance on the outcome of these tests. Alfred Binet, initial exploration into the construct of intelligence led to the publication of the book Experimental Studies of Intelligence in 1903. This book detailed a basic methodology for investigating intelligence and laid the groundwork for his intelligence test. In 1905, a paper written by Binet and Theodore Simon announced the development of an objective measure of intellectual ability. The purpose of the test was to distinguish students with intellectual deficits from their peers. The actual test was then published a couple of months later and known as the Binet-Simon scale. The scale underwent many revisions, including important revisions at Stanford University. It was at this point that the test took on its current name, the Stanford-Binet. The Stanford-Binet test is currently in its fifth major revision and is one of the most frequently used tests of intelligence. The theory and methodology behind the Binet scales are important because they influenced the conceptualization of intelligence today. Theoretically, Binet envisioned intelligence as a single construct. He believed that each function in the world driven by a single intellectual ability. He referred to this as a person's mental ability. He believed that students with intellectual disability had mental age that was inconsistent with their chronological age. A student with intellectual disability might have a chronological age of 10, but a mental age of 5. Before this intellectual test, the idea of mental age was just a theoretical construct. The test operationalized mental age by giving professionals a means to quantify this concept. Binet thought it important for his test to provide a numerical product he could use to determine the need for special services. He wanted to assign students a number based on his assessment, and then that number could be used to determine the necessity for services. To generate this number, he developed a very simple formula based on the division of mental age and chronological age. This quotient became the first intelligence score and was known as the intelligence quotient. This was quickly abbreviated to IQ, and the terminology is still in use today. Binet's work was indeed groundbreaking in that it brought intelligence out of the purely theoretical and put it into an actual measurable product. Teachers no longer had to speculate how smart a student was. The student could simply be tested. There were many positive outcomes of this process, but there are also some serious cautions to consider. One of the most important is a lack of association between the measurement of intelligence and the theory of intelligence. Intellectual tests approach measurements from a particular way of understanding intelligence. General intelligence is the idea that there is one broad cognitive ability governing intelligent behavior. It is usually abbreviated by a lowercase g. Intelligence is viewed as a singular entity. The work of Binet contributed significantly to our thinking about intelligence. The test took intelligent behavior and reduced it to a single score, furthering the idea of intelligence as one. Charles Spearman in 1927 also produced significant scientific works from this perspective. He proposed that intelligence was a single mental attribute, which he abbreviated as G for general education. He believed general intelligence was a pervasive attribute governing the performance of most tasks. He also proposed that general intelligence interacted with specific abilities in each area, such as music, math, etc. He abbreviated this as S. Although he theorized both G and S were important in understanding intelligent behavior, he placed greater emphasis on G. He believed that since G was the most enduring quality and less sensitive to task variations, it was the most important characteristic. And G, of course, in this case, is general intelligence. Popular IQ tests, such as the Wechsler, have been repeatedly found to do a good job at predicting academic success as determined by school grades. IQ scores correlate well with achievement tests. There is growing evidence that IQ tests correlate positively with real-life outcomes, such as job success and earning potential. This supporting evidence also brings up the significant reservations. Although IQ does a good job at predicting certain real-world outcomes, it does not do a perfect job. This means there are still other relevant factors in determining life outcomes. Factors such as motivation, education, and the ability to interact well with others. Those are interpersonal skills. Also appear to play an important role in our success. And if you remember from earlier in the text, he said that the environment was created 80% of the individual's personality, and genetics, or IQ, only produced 20%. So we're dealing with that 20-80 dichotomy, I guess. Multiple intelligences is the idea that intelligence is not a single construct, but a collection of distinct abilities. Each intelligence in this view is relatively independent of the others. If it is true that intelligence is not derived from a single ability, then individual abilities may vary substantially from each other. This is unlikely under the general intelligence perspective, since only one intelligence drives all abilities. Part of the attractiveness and popularity of the multiple intelligence perspective is that it appears to fit the intuitive sense most people have regarding their own intelligence. We excel in some areas and struggle in others. Our sense of our intellectual ability typically varies depending on the task. According to Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, there are 8 separate intelligences. Gardner is quick to point out that the specific number of abilities is not the crucial part of his theory. He has speculated about their intelligences, such as spirituality or the ability to contemplate larger life issues. What is important is that our abilities function independently. Gardner contends that this view of intelligence is important because it encourages researchers and educators to think about the intelligence in different ways. It provides an alternative framework for trying to understand the complex learning needs of students. Robert Sternberg has developed a triarchic theory of intelligence. Sternberg's theory looks at intelligence as a compilation of distinct abilities. Sternberg details three areas of intellectual functioning. Analytic componential intelligence is like the type of intelligence assessed by traditional tests of intellectual functioning. It emphasizes problem solving, commonly used in academic settings. Creative experimental intelligence is that part of the intelligence behavior that allows for creative and effective responses to novel situations. It involves insight into problems and the ability to connect relevant aspects of novel situations. Practical contextual intelligence is the way an individual interacts and understands their world. This component of intelligence is probably one of the most important of Sternberg's contributions to intelligence theory. It is easy to assume that a high score on an intelligence test means a student will do well in a class, will do well on today's assignment, and or will have the answer to the question asked. This may or may not be true. IQ tests are good predictors of academic success, but it's not a guarantee. People are complex, and there are many factors determining academic success or failure. To make good and appropriate use of intellectual testing, teachers need not only to be aware of the theoretical underpinnings of the test, but also the nature of test items. This is really important because I have relatives who have IQs between 140 and 160, and these individuals never made it through the 8th grade. Why? Because they're lazy and because they don't want to do anything. They live on welfare, as strange as that is. They don't function. They have no function. It doesn't matter how smart you are. It's what you do with your intelligence that is important. That was my dad's theory. He didn't mind sending people to college. He'd pay for all your education, but when you finished, you better, by golly, you better use your education for what it was, what he just paid for. I have nieces that went to college and became teachers, and they taught for a year, and then they stopped. They just stopped doing it because it was so stressful, I guess. As stupid as that is. Anyway, okay, so IQ just means potential. David Wexler produced a series of intellectual measures covering all school-age children and adults. His intellectual assessment series includes the Wexler Primary and Preschool Scale of Intelligence 4, Wexler Intelligence Scale for Children 5, and the Wexler Adult Intelligence Scale 4. The WISC 5 has a total of 10 core tests and 6 supplemental tests. The 10 core tests are required to calculate a full-scale intelligence quotient score. The FSIQ is the global measure of an intellectual functioning. That would be very similar to the Stanford Binet score. Administration of the supplemental tests enables the calculation and additional scores called index scores. Index scores provide additional information on specific aspects of intellectual functioning. Now we're talking about indexes from the WISC 5. Verbal Comprehension Index. This index assesses a child's ability to understand and express verbal information. It includes subtests that measure vocabulary knowledge, comprehension of verbal concepts, and verbal reasoning skills. A high VCI score may indicate proficiency in verbal tasks, while a low score might suggest difficulties in language comprehension or expression. And I have a sister with an IQ of 135, and she hates to read. So maybe her verbal comprehension index would be very low, despite her high Stanford-Binet IQ. Visual Spatial Index evaluates a child's visual processing and spatial reasoning abilities. Subtests in this index assess skills such as visual motor integration, spatial visualization, and visual organization. A high VSI score suggests strengths in visual thinking and spatial analysis, whereas a low score may indicate challenges in these areas. The FRI, the Fluid Reasoning Index, measures a child's nonverbal reasoning and problem-solving skills. It includes subtests that assess the ability to identify patterns, make logical deductions, and solve novel problems. A high FRI score implies strong abstract reasoning abilities, whereas a low score may suggest difficulties in flexible thinking or problem solving. Working Memory Index evaluates a child's working memory capacity and the ability to retain and manipulate information in real time. Subtests in this index assess skills such as digit span, letter number sequencing, and arithmetic. A high WMI score indicates efficient working memory functioning, while a low score might suggest challenges in maintaining and processing information simultaneously. Processing Speed Index, PSI, measures a child's speed of processing visual information and motor response speed. Subtests in this index assess skills such as symbol search, coding, and cancellation tasks. A high PSI score suggests efficient processing of information, while a low score may indicate slower processing speed or difficulties with visual motor coordination. Today's intelligence tests calculate IQ scores quite differently from the score originally developed by Alfred Binet. The meaning of the IQ scores derived from Binet's original formula changes as the individual ages. This means the IQ would appear to vary over time, even if actual intelligence was stable. This presented several application problems, so researchers looked for alternative approaches to generate an intelligence score. The new IQ is the deviation IQ, still in use today. Calculating IQ using a deviation approach involves two separate processes. First, researchers collect performance data on intellectual tests from thousands of individuals. The researchers attempt to draw participants from all segments of the population, so the resulting database of scores accurately reflects American society. The second process occurs after the original database is collected and involves administering the test to an individual for clinical reasons, such as testing a student to answer a specific question regarding their performance at school. Comparing the single student score on the IQ test to the existing database of scores provides a comparative or relative interpretation. The specific nature of how the comparison is formulated is complicated, but essentially we look to see how far the individual score deviates from scores in the database. Becoming a teacher is one of the most regulated professions in history. All 50 states have rigorous licensing and education standards for becoming a teacher. Teachers taking a qualifying test have been around for some time. Taking a qualifying test has been around. Okay. This has led to stringent standards for licensure. Individual states license teachers, so standards for professional development vary according to state guidelines. Despite this variation, there is growing cohesion in the process of testing teacher preparedness. Currently, about 40 states and territorial jurisdictions use the Praxis TM series for assessing teacher preparation and performance. Now, the reality is that Arizona and New Mexico do not use the Praxis. New Mexico used to use the Praxis, but this year is the year that they stopped. Utah and Colorado, which are the other four corner states, do use the praxis. So if you plan to teach in Utah or Colorado, you're going to have to take the praxis. If you teach in Arizona and New Mexico, if you plan to teach in Arizona and New Mexico, you will not have to take the praxis. The praxis is a series of 3 different tests. Individual states can adopt any one of the individual tests or all 3. Teaching standards are clearly defined goals states have for the development of high-quality teachers. Most state standards follow the core standards developed by the Interstate New Teacher Assessment and Support Consortium. INTASC is an initiative of the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization consisting of state superintendents of education in the United States. INTASC was established to develop model standards for the preparation and licensing of new teachers. INTASC created a set of core principles and standards that outline the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that novice teachers should possess. These INTASC standards serve as a guide for teacher education programs, state licensing agencies, and other stakeholders involved in teacher preparation and certification. The INTASC standards cover various aspects of teaching, including subject matter knowledge, pedagogical knowledge and skills, assessment diversity, and cultural competency, instructional planning, and professional ethics. The standards are intended to ensure that new teachers are adequately prepared to meet the needs of the diverse learners and provide effective instruction in the classroom. A fundamental concept in testing is that we need tools to describe a group of scores. We need to know if the scores were generally high or low. We need to know if most students achieved a similar score. A common approach is to examining score distribution is to generate frequency distribution. This is a graphical depiction of how many students earned each of the possible scores on the test. The frequency distribution is an excellent way to represent visually how a group of students performed on a test. It also illustrates the concept of central tendency. Central tendency is the tendency for scores to cluster around the center of a distribution of scores. Not all scores will cluster toward the center of a distribution, but central tendency is a robust phenomenon across a wide range of areas. In general, when large groups of people are measured, most people will score somewhere close to the middle, with fewer people scoring very high or very low. To describe how much scores cluster in the center of a distribution, we have developed several measures of central tendency. The mean is calculated by adding all the scores and then dividing the sum by a total number of scores. The median is a score occurring in the middle of a ranked distribution. Rank the scores from highest to lowest. The median is the score in the middle of the column of scores. If you have an even number of scores, there is no exact middle score. To determine the median in this case, you take the 2 scores that surround the middle of the distribution and calculate a simple average. You add the 2 together and divide by 2. This average is the median for an even number of scores. The mode is the score in a distribution occurring most frequently. The easiest way to determine the mode is to use a frequency distribution. Usually inspect the frequency distribution and see what bar is the highest. Since height of individual bars represent how frequently a given score was earned, the score with the highest bar is the mode. Notice that distributions frequently have more than one mode or most frequent score. This happens when more than one score occurs most frequently. When looking at scores from a group a good quality to explore is how far apart they occur or deviate from each other. The standard deviation is a measure of variability. It tells us how much the scores vary from the mean. Add each score to get a sum, divide the sum by the number of scores to get an average, subtract each score from the average, square the difference for each score, add all the squared differences, divide the sum of the squared differences by the number of scores, take the square root of this number, and that is your standard deviation. And this is what the formula looks like. It's not that difficult to do, actually. The standard deviation follows the 68, 95, 99.7 rule. According to the rule, 68% of the scores in each group will fall within one standard deviation above and below the mean. This rule holds that 95% of the scores will fall between two standard deviations above and below the mean. Finally, 99.7% of the scores will fall between three standard deviations above and below the mean. The smaller the standard deviation, the tighter the scores cluster around the average score. Larger standard deviations mean the scores are more spread out across the distribution. The range of a set of scores is the highest and the lowest score. The range can be useful to capture variability in scores, but range should be used with caution. If there is a single score in a distribution that is unusual compared to the others, the range may be deceptive. This is unclear looking only at the range. Standard deviations are similarly affected by unusually high or low scores, but not as significantly as the range. When a distribution of scores is characterized by most scores clustering close to the average, we call this a normal distribution. The normal distribution is known by several names, including the bell curve, because it looks like a bell. It's shaped like a bell. In addition to following the 68, 95, 99.7 rule, normal distributions are also characterized by half of the scores falling above the mean and half the scores falling below the mean. This standardized tests produce a normal distribution of scores when administered to a large group of individuals. Standardized test results are often expressed in terms of a grade level. Grade equivalents express performance in terms of an approximate grade level. This is accomplished by giving a particular test to many students at each grade level. The test makers obtain a mean each grade level. Then when a student is given the test, their score can be compared to the previously determined grade averages. Age equivalents are usually based on comparing a student's score on a test to the average score on the same test for various ages. Perhaps a 10-year-old achieved a score on a test that is an average score for a 15-year-old. This does not mean that the 10-year-old is capable of the same kind of work as a 15-year-old. The 10-year-old simply has very well-developed skills for a 10-year-old. And I figured mine out. My age equivalency is 107. So you can, I'm not that old yet. I hope not. Percentile rank is a statistical measure that indicates the percentage of scores that a particular score is equal to or greater than. It is commonly used in educational assessments to compare an individual's performance to a larger group. Percentile rank helps provide a context for understanding an individual's performance relative to others in a specific group or population. It is often used in educational assessments to evaluate student performance, track growth over time, and compare individuals or groups of students. Scaled scores are a statistical transformation of raw scores that allow for standardized and meaningful interpretation of test performances. Raw scores represent the number of items or score a student makes on a test without any modification. Scaled scores are commonly used in educational assessments to provide a consistent scale for comparing and interpreting scores across different test forms or administrations. And the reality is, if you give a test, you need to understand what the score means. And that's why all of this is important. Reliability is when a test produces consistent results. If you give a test to the same person on multiple occasions, you will obtain comparable results each time. This does not mean identical results, just similar results. The idea behind reliability is that the test can measure consistently and vary substantially due to error. Makers of standardized tests typically give you the actual test score plus a confidence interval. The confidence interval is a range of scores believed to contain the student's true score. The inherent error involved in measuring makes it difficult to represent performance with a single score, but we can state that a particular range of scores contains the true score. There are several approaches to determine test reliability. Retest reliability uses two administrations of the test. The test is given once and then given again later. Reliability is determined by assessing the similarity in scores across the two administrations. Alternate form reliability is established by giving comparable forms of the same test to the same students. Reliability is determined by looking at similarity in scores. Split half reliability divides the test items of a single test into two groups. When the two groups are compared to see if respondents perform, then you compare the two groups and to see if the respondents perform similarly. You can use odd numbers and compare them to even numbers. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Validity refers to whether a test measures what it intends to measure. Content-related validity is established by examining whether relevant content domains are included in the test. A potential issue with this form of validity is that it presumes that relevant domains are known. Criterion-related validity is a prediction about the performance on a test against some other related criterion. A potential drawback to this approach to validity is that comparison tests may have its own validity problems. Construct-related validity, a judgment as to whether the test accurately measures the intended construct. This is the broadest form of validity and is established over a period of years through cumulated evidence. And the thing about validity is that it's like a driving test. If you just took a paper test to show that you should have a driver's license, would that be valid? No, you need to show that you can actually get on the road in a car and be able to drive. So that's what validity is all about, and that's the end of the chapter, and I'll talk to you again next.